on you. If you bring back a good report, perhaps we can cancel out certain unfortunate items in your record. But one other should board with you." His eyes turned toward John Sabo. "Not me. This is your goat." The mate's eyes were sullen. "This is gross breach, and you know it. They'll have you in irons when we get back. I don't want anything to do with it." "You're under orders, Sabo. You keep forgetting." "They're illegal orders, sir." "I'll take responsibility for that." Sabo looked the old man straight in the eye. "You mean you'd sell us down a rat-hole to save your skin? That's what you mean?" Captain Loomis' eyes widened incredulously. Then his face darkened, and he stepped very close to the big man. "You'll watch your tongue, I think," he gritted. "Be careful what you say to me, Sabo. Be very careful. Because if you don't, you'll be in irons, and we'll see just how long you last when you get back home. Now, you've got your orders. You'll board the ship with Brownie." The big man's fists were clenched until the knuckles were white. "You don't know what's over there," he burst out. "We could be slaughtered." The captain's smile was unpleasant. "That would be such a pity," he murmured. "I'd really hate to see it happen." The ship hung dark and silent, like a shadowy ghost. No flicker of light could be seen aboard it. No sound nor faintest sign of life came from the tall, dark hull plates. It hung there, huge and imponderable, and swung around with the station in its silent orbit. The men huddled about Sado and Brownie, helping them into their pressure suits, checking their equipment. They had watched the little scanning beetles crawl over the surface of the great ship, examining, probing every nook and crevice, reporting crystals and metals and irons, while the boarding party prepared. And still the radio man waited alertly for a flicker of life from the solemn giant. Frightened as they were of their part in the illegal secrecy, the arrival of the ship had brought a change in the crew, lighting fires of excitement in their eyes. They moved faster, their voices were lighter, more cheerful. Long months on the station had worn on their nerves, out of contact with their homes, on a mission that was secretly jeered as utter government folly. Ships had been seen, years before, disappearing into the sullen, bright atmospheric crust of Saturn, but there had been no sign of anything since. And out there, on the lonely guard station, nerves had run ragged, always waiting, always watching, wearing away even the iron discipline of their military background. They grew bitterly weary of the same faces, the same routine, the constant repetition of inactivity. And through the months they had watched with increasing anxiety the conflict growing between the captain and his bitter, sullen-eyed second-in-command, John Sabo. And then the ship had come, incredibly, from the depths of space, and the tensions of loneliness were forgotten in the flurry of activity. The locks whined and opened as the two men moved out of the station on the little propulsion sleds, linked to the station with light silk guide ropes. Sabo settled himself on the sled, cursing himself for falling so foolishly into the captain's scheme, cursing his tongue for wandering. And deep within him he felt a new sensation, a vague uneasiness and insecurity that he had not felt in all his years of military life. The strange ship was a variant, an imponderable factor thrown suddenly into his small world of hatred and bitterness, forcing him into unknown territory, throwing his mind into a welter of doubts and fears. He glanced uneasily across at Brownie, vaguely wishing that someone else were with him. Brownie was a troublemaker. Brownie talked too much. Brownie philosophized in a world that ridiculed philosophy. He'd known men like Brownie before, and he knew that they couldn't be trusted. The gray hull gleamed at them as they moved toward it, a monstrous wall of polished metal. There were no dents, no surface scars from its passage through space. They found the entrance lock without difficulty near the top of the ship's great hull, and Brownie probed the rim of the lock with a dozen instruments, his dark eyes burning eagerly. And then, with a squeal that grated in Sabo's ears, the oval port of the ship quivered and slowly opened. Silently, the sleds moved into the opening. They were in a small vault, quite dark, and the sled settled slowly onto a metal deck. Sabo eased himself from the seat, tuning up his audios to their highest sensitivity, moving over to Brownie. Momentarily, they touched helmets, and Brownie's excited voice came to him, muted but breathless. "No trouble getting it open. It worked on the same principle as ours." "Better get to work on the inner lock." Brownie shot him a sharp glance. "But what about inside? I mean, we can't just walk in on them." "Why not? We've tried to contact them." Reluctantly, the little engineer began probing the inner lock with trembling fingers. Minutes later, they were easing themselves through, moving slowly down the dark corridor, waiting with pounding hearts for a sound, a sign. The corridor joined another, and then still another, until they reached a great oval door. And then they were inside, in the heart of the ship, and their eyes widened as they stared at the thing in the center of the great vaulted chamber. "My God!" Brownie's voice was a hoarse whisper in the stillness. "Look at them, Johnny!" Sabo moved slowly across the room toward the frail, crushed form lying against the great, gleaming panel. Thin, almost boneless arms were pasted against the hard metal. An oval, humanoid skull was crushed like an eggshell into the knobs and levers of the control panel. Sudden horror shot through the big man as he looked around. At the far side of the room was another of the things, and still another, mashed, like lifeless jelly, into the floors and panels. Gently, he peeled a bit of jelly away from the metal, then turned with a mixture of wonder and disgust. "All dead," he muttered. Brownie looked up at him, his hands trembling. "No wonder there was no sign." He looked about helplessly. "It's a derelict, Johnny. A wanderer. How could it have happened? How long ago?" Sabo shook his head, bewildered. "Then it was just chance that it came to us, that we saw it." "No pilots, no charts. It might have wandered for centuries." Brownie stared about the room, a frightened look on his face. And then he was leaning over the control panel, probing at the array of levers, his fingers working eagerly at the wiring. Sabo nodded approvingly. "We'll have to go over it with a comb," he said. "I'll see what I can find in the rest of the ship. You go ahead on the controls and drive." Without waiting for an answer, he moved swiftly from the round chamber, out into the corridor again, his stomach almost sick. It took them many hours. They moved silently, as if even a slight sound might disturb the sleeping alien forms, smashed against the dark metal panels. In another room were the charts, great beautiful charts, totally unfamiliar, studded with star formations he had never seen, noted with curious, meaningless symbols. As Sabo worked, he heard Brownie moving down into the depths of the ship, toward the giant engine rooms. And then some silent alarm clicked into place in Sabo's mind, tightening his stomach, screaming to be heard. Heart pounding, he dashed down the corridor like a cat, seeing again in his mind the bright, eager eyes of the engineer. Suddenly, the meaning of that eagerness dawned on him. He scampered down a ladder, along a corridor, and down another ladder, down to the engine room, almost colliding with Brownie as he crossed from one of the engines to a battery of generators on the far side of the room. "Brownie, what's the trouble?" Sabo trembled, then turned away. "Nothing," he muttered. "Just a thought." But he watched as the little man snaked into the labyrinth of dynamos and coils and wires, peering eagerly, probing, searching, making notes in the little pad